Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me today for the Q&A for lesson 8. And we had a great question here that we're going to continue answering. And it's probably a big part of today's talk is with the planting system design and how different layers of plantings interact with each other. So did you want to just repeat your question, just so we have it here?
Sure, not a problem. I'm just wondering how things need spaced because trees will say so far, and then you're supposed to have 2 shrubs to 1 tree, and then like 10 to 12 perennials around that. And I'm just trying to figure out the accurate spacing. Like, is it against the trunk of the tree that you would space the shrub, or is it from shrub to shrub?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. So are you, I guess, a couple of questions, because you are on acreage and you're thinking about adding some nut and fruit trees. So do you see that as a traditional orchard layout that wherein you have your fruit and nut trees in an area on their own, so to speak? Is that what you see?
That's what we were kind of thinking of. Since there's so many oak trees on the property, we wanted to kind of not get it, since there's such a cover story, we wanted to have them in their straight sun often in an area.
Sure. So one of the interesting, I mean, there's so many approaches. As far as spacing goes, yes, we want to, spacing is generally done from the center of one plant to the center of another. So let's say your shrub that you're looking at is a 6 foot wide, ultimately is 6 foot wide based on what you know. And you wanted to have an adjoining plant, an adjoining shrub, this may be the same one. So you would place that 6 feet away on center if you wanted them to touch when they become mature, right?
Okay.
And this, when we look at different layers, then we have to really start considering what ultimately these plants are going to look like. So we know what perhaps a shrub might look like. Let's say it's a blueberry, right? For lack of, or an aronia or something like that. So it's maybe a 5 or 6 foot high, 5 or 6 foot wide. And let's say you want to plant some chestnuts. I'm not sure what nut trees you're thinking about, but let's just say it's chestnut. Or maybe we'll select what you're considering. Or what was your initial
We were
thought?
looking at almonds, hazelnuts, and pistachios.
Okay, so let's go with almonds. Let's say your almond requirements are 20-foot spacing. If you wanted those canopies to touch, so you have to think about that. Do you want those canopies to ultimately touch? Maybe, maybe not, right? If it's in an orchard area, you probably want to get them fairly close so you can increase the density. So let's say you laid out 2 almonds. So boom, they're 20 foot apart. So the thing to do is to look at that understory now. So the story under the almond, we could classify as that shrub layer, because almonds aren't going to get, they're not the huge canopy trees, they're smaller. You would then look at getting some other layers developed beneath them. So the shrub layer would then come below them. And then even below that, you could look at herbaceous. So you could essentially have some almonds and some aronia. If you're not familiar with aronia, it's like a drought-tolerant black blueberry. Then you could have strawberries. So you have biodiversity and habitat at these various different layers, and that really helps maximize your space versus almonds only. So
okay, so for instance, in that 20-foot space of almond and almond, would you be putting, say, 2 blueberries in that space or more like 3?
I hate to say it, but it does depend a lot on the context.
Yeah.
But let's say you see, these are really different approaches. So if you're doing an orchard traditionally, like in that traditional sense, you'd be planting, walking 20 feet, planting, and then you'd probably have turf or pasture or something in between, right? Now, if you are looking at making that a more intense, diverse planting, you would actually, in all likelihood, have a strip, a mound strip that you're planting into. So in other words, you want to fill that strip. Okay, I'll give you an example here. And again, it is context. And a good example of this sort of thing. Sorry, there's an image that I have in my head here that I've referred to many times. Aha, okay. We'll just share screen here 1 second. There we go. So here's an image of, it's a large scale agricultural system. And you'll see that it is called a keyline. This is a keyline layout. And we're not really getting into keyline in this course. But this is a fantastic way of distributing water on a site rather than, let's say, swales, right? This is a really good, now this is a keyline mound. It's not traditional keyline. Let me just find that for you here. Oh gosh. Well. There we go. Now we'll get, there we go. Got the same picture there, but normally keyline design is actually, it's almost like a subsoil decompacting, water harvesting plow that can aid in water distribution and decompaction and yet not disturb the soil surface. So it's a brilliant system designed by P.A. Yeomans in Australia years ago. And this is some of the sort of patterns that can develop. So this is a tree planting right here, but it's not in a traditional grid. So in this system, you get much more even distribution of water, because what it's doing is you're basically using this plow, right? The subsoiling plow to create these different patterns. And here they're just, it looks like they're doing a whole field, whereas in this case, they probably just did one rip representing where they're going to be planting. So often they will rip and then they can create a mound system. And then here you would get tree, potentially tree, shrub, perennial plantings. Now, here, they're most likely just doing tree and shrub. It would be pretty onerous to be managing herbaceous plants on this scale with this sort of setup.
Mm-hmm.
But just to give you a quick briefing on this, the whole idea is to take water from a valley to a ridge. So you see this is a distinct ridge here, and ridges are traditionally the driest point on a landscape. And the valleys, this is just a little valley that is, that's where all the water is going to be collecting and running through. So this pattern would be off contour, and it would pull that water out to the ridge. So that's a very simplistic explanation. It's not a super easy concept to grasp. Here is a keyline planting, but they have no other plantings at all. It's just trees, and in all likelihood, they are doing, these are evenly spaced, so that's one thing you'll notice, as opposed to contour. These are all evenly spaced, so in an agricultural setting, they're completely functional, right? They could have this, they could graze animals between the trees. They could run, they could be haying this area. They could run annual crops in here. And here's an example. So again, these rows are parallel so that their usage is, you know, the highest possible use for a farmer. And it's quite an amazing system. And we try and mimic this, say on an acreage scale. You could essentially, maybe not in your location, again, it's really context specific, but here they were able to alleviate some of the water needs of these new trees through this layout. Now, it doesn't mean they're not having to irrigate them, but it does mean that they're trying to distribute water more evenly. And when it's successful, you can see the results in that these trees become very even in their growth, which is a great thing to see, rather than typically you would see them more dense in the valley, and then they would be more stressed on the ridge, right? So that is a quick snapshot. There's all sorts of information that you can acquire. But the even patterns are really interesting. We just, we're doing a farm design right now, and just went through establishing some keyline patterning for that. But it's a very flat site, so it's a slightly different approach. So again, it's context specific, but it is a really interesting water management tool. As well, it provides you with all these options. So let's say on a small scale, you were to run your trees and shrubs along here. Say these were mounds like we had here, and your trees are every 20 foot, and then in between you're just filling it up with shrubs. And this gets a little bit closer to that. I'm trying to remember the exact name for it. Syntropic agriculture, where it's a very interesting system. They will plant, completely overplant a row like that. And as the systems develop, they start to thin them a bit, but they'll have that tall canopy, shorter canopy, shrub layer, herbaceous layer, all densely planted. And they end up kind of working it out, but you end up having to overplant And again, it's a completely different system, but it's all about soil building. And I don't want to, I'll be careful here not to venture off into too many different wormholes. But this is a very interesting concept. So with an orchard in a small acreage, this is what we are doing on one of the properties that we're designing. And I'll try and find a PDF for that, and that might be helpful to take a look at, because it's a small enough scale where we can do all these different layers. Sorry, I'm just, it's not something I had. Aha, this might help. Okay. So we'll stop that share and we'll jump to another. All right, so these are just planting plan sheets. So here is an example, and I'll try and zoom in. Okay, so in this example, and this is a small acreage, it's probably 6 acres. And we have these, we have basically a hedgerow at the top of the planting that you can't totally see here. This is kind of a little section of the drawing. And here we're just really pointing to the semi-dwarf fruit trees. But when we get into the larger nut trees, you can see we have, get my little tool here, sorry. We have our nut trees. We have then underplantings of shrubs and underplantings of herbaceous. So to reduce maintenance for these clients, we need to occupy the ground. And if you imagine that mound I showed you before, if we did nothing with it, you know, it's just going to be chaotic, because it's going to try and, you know, nature's always trying to heal, and we have disturbed, it's boom, you're going to have weed activity and all sorts of things going on that are trying to, again, heal that soil. So when we, let's say this is very much the same look that we're after. So we're going to have, you know, probably a 4 or 5 foot wide mound, and space all of those nut trees so they're touching, and then have this increased yield beneath them in terms of shrub. So tree, canopy, tree, shrub, and herbaceous. And then when we look at these semi-dwarfs here, we're not, in this situation, we have more space between them, and we're not going to put a shrub level, a shrub layer, because we feel there's just going to be too much conflict with the lower branches of the fruit trees and the shrubs. But we are going to go with a cover crop, which will switch over into more herbaceous layers. So we'll still have those 2 layers. And I guess the takeaway here, no matter what you're doing, is to try and think in those layered systems, as well as trying to look ahead at reducing maintenance. So in our experience, if we occupy the ground with the design, with what we want, there's going to be less work involved in terms of looking after them. If we put just the nut trees in that mound and say we wood chipped it, you're still going to be chasing the weeds, you know. because it's going to want to, and maybe that's what you want, and that's completely fine on a large agricultural setting, like some of those images I showed you, that would be just tree only. So they would actually have a tree planter, you know, being pulled behind a tractor, and they're putting in fairly small young trees, and then they come behind and protect them, and then they mulch them, but they're not worried about these other layers because it's just not practical for them to plant. You know, they're planting thousands, whereas your scale, you're looking at, you know, maybe tens, right? So you can really increase the potential yield from an area, plus have healthier plants, using that sort of an approach.
Okay.
Does that make
Thank you.
sense? Okay, so also when we get into more perennial plantings, instead of strips, we're looking at larger spaces, and the same, we carry the same strategy forward with that. When, let's say, I don't know if I have an example on that sheet. Just taking a look here. No, I don't have it on that sheet, and I didn't prepare myself for that kind of a question, but it's the same premise. So we have a bed, and we have in our mind, we want to put some trees in there. So let's say they're fruit trees or nut trees or whatever they happen to be, and there's enough space for them and the light works well. Just excuse me one sec. I just have to shut my door here. Oh, there we go. Great. Busy household. So with a bed, it's the same idea. We actually, when we're designing it, lay out where we want those trees to go, so they have the space they need. And then we look at the space in between them and see what we can do with shrub material. And the shrub material, we may want them to touch. We may want them to have a little space. So that's a very, you know, artistic approach. It doesn't, you know, there's no right or wrong. And then we look at the herbaceous plants. And then, of course, there's, you know, many others. There's climbers, there's your ground cover. When I say herbaceous, I'm lumping a lot of different plants into that. But it's really covering those different layers. And I've always done that in my work. I was really lucky I was introduced to it very early, because there's a lot of landscapes that you see where they're just, let's say, especially commercial landscapes, you drive by and there'll be tree and shrub, and then it's just bare ground, right? So that's just, you know, that's just opening up the maintenance nightmare for whoever's got to look after it. Even if you put wood chips or whatever, those are going to help. But you want, you know, you look to nature, and nature's going to occupy vacant space, and so you want to try and do that with your own landscape intentionally. And it takes years of trial and error to figure out what's working for you. But if you get the tree and shrub layer right, and you're happy, and those plants are happy, those perennials, you can easily shift those around. And those are kind of the really organic part of a landscape that often need division, like strawberries. You know, you have a strawberry, it grows like crazy. In 3 or 4 years, you know, it's getting less, you get less production. So you're going to want to take some new runners and start new plants with them. So it's that kind of a approach. But yeah, this exercise is a little bit tricky that way, and I find most people are leaning just to a very conservative approach where they put less plants in, and that actually just creates way more work for themselves. So it's a little bit tricky.
I have have a question that's on a different topic. So if you're not finished with this, or if somebody else has something related to this to ask.
No, you go ahead, Mary. I think we covered we're going to go through we'll go through the assignment shortly, but we'll take your
Okay.
question now. Sure.
Downspouts near the house,
Mm-hmm.
where it's also like zone 1.
Mm.
So, because ideally you want the water to go away from the foundation of the house.
Mm-hmm.
However, then you're losing all this potential for the plantings that are so, like, how do you deal with just lost with that?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it depends on your context, but often what we do, well, I'll describe what we do on our property. So with our rainwater management, because that's really what it is, right? We're trying to manage the water the best we can.
Right.
One half of our roof, we are collecting into a cistern. And when that cistern is full, it overflows and will go into a swale that is a little bit further away from the cistern. So in fact, in our situation, it's quite a bit further away. The cistern that we have has a pump in it, and we pump our water. It's really a pump chamber. So we pump that water up to a higher point on our property, and we have about 12,000 gallons of storage. And we use that water for our annual vegetable crops. But, you know, we quickly can store that and collect and store it quite quickly during the rainy season. So we have an alternative route for the other half of our roof. It goes into, I'll see if I can get a picture of it here for you. It goes into, here's a question for you, Mary. Do your downspouts just sort of empty out onto the ground? Or do they?
There are currently, there's tubing connected to the bottom. So they touch the ground, but then there's tubing to move the water flow away from the house.
Right. So that's often, oh, my pictures aren't cooperating right now. That is often the case with some homes. So, but what we do, you probably have a home that's on slab, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So when we have a crawl space, so that's like a 3-foot little space beneath our bottom floor. And because of that, we have a foundation wall. And then because of that, we have perimeter drainage. And all of our roof leaders go into solid PVC piping that takes it from the house down to a swale that's a little bit lower on our property.
Okay.
So that's what we do. We just grab it and control it. And you can do that on a smaller scale if it's an urban setting. You don't have to just release it to the ground. You could actually put it into some piping and send it, let's say, to a rain garden. So a rain garden's an excellent option for most urban settings. And it, you know, I would say 90% of the urban landscapes we design, we will place a rain garden in it. And it's part of an overall system. So if there's something we can do with the water before and after, we will do that. So there's this connection. So if we're storing water, when we've stored all we can and it's overflowing, then it will go into a rain garden. And then if the rain garden got overwhelmed during a high rain event, maybe it's going somewhere else, right? But it has to go somewhere else, but maybe it's somewhere else still within the landscape. So it's an interconnected system. Water systems often are, and it takes a little bit of practice to sort of grapple with that. But the cheapest, best approach often is storing water within your soil
Right.
rather than within a cistern. They're expensive and they're getting harder to get. But, you know, for instance, where we have a little swale on our property, we have a bunch of, it's right above our orchard area, and we have a bunch of raspberries on a mound below the swale. So, and they don't require any irrigation. So
Okay.
that's one way of making the best use of the water.
And I guess one of my other questions is, I mean, so where the drain spout comes down, there's plantings.
Mhm.
They're not getting any of that water. Should I just accept that they're not going to get any of the water because I've got to get it away from the house?
Yeah, you want to take your water at least 10 feet away from the perimeter of your house. And I would say, you know, more is better.
Right.
More than 10. I've had water. We were infiltrating water more like 30 or 40 feet from our house,
Okay.
and I saw it impact our foundation. It was very interesting. Didn't harm it or anything, but I could see that that water was sliding along an impervious layer underground and headed towards our house. So
Yep.
we changed that strategy a little bit to relieve the pressure. So taking it away from the house and making sure it's not going to head back towards it is a great plan.
Okay.
But
Thank you.
if you Google, well, we could do that right now. Let's just do that. We'll go back to our Keyline. Let's say. There's some really basic components that make it much easier. This is a very simple setup, you know, doesn't take a lot of resources.
Right.
The trouble is these barrels fill up rapidly,
Right.
and then before you know it, they're overflowing. Just trying to find one of the key parts that we use is this here. This is pretty easy to access in most places in North America. And this is called a leaf eater. They come under different names, but what it does is with your downspout, no matter what your downspout is, it's going to take that water, filter it. So you're going to get 1,000 microns of filtration. And then you're going into a solid pipe. So you eliminate any chance for any vectors to get into your stored water. As well, you are filtering out a little bit. You need to increase the filtration a little, but so that's one of the options. It's to transition. You can also transition right up at the gutter. We had to do that at our house, and it's not as nice because you have to, you know, these are pretty maintenance free, but occasionally you have to clear the debris depending on the type of roofing you have. They also come in this type of look, but that is, in my opinion, an essential part of grabbing the rainwater and utilizing it. So on our property, where half of our roof goes just goes to a swale, it doesn't go to a cistern. We still have rain heads on every downspout because I don't want that debris in my piping. So I know I'll never have to clean it out. It'll always be running nice and smooth. So yeah, keep your eyes open for something like that. These are pretty cheap. They're about $35, I think, up here. And there's a number of different types, but then you can go into a solid pipe, you see, and you could go underground, like shown here. and take that anywhere you want. But of course, you're going to want to be mindful of the slope. So
Right.
you want to have a 1% slope on that. And there's all sorts of information here. See, in this situation, they have the leaf diverter, they call it, up near the gutter. And then they're putting the piping underground. Maybe in your case, you're just putting it in through a leaf catcher or leaf eater, and then it runs a few feet to a rain garden, right?
Okay.
So it's just whatever you do, you should try and consider to have an overflow built in, so
Okay.
that if you have a strong surge of water, which can happen with a big rain event, that it has somewhere to go. People get into trouble when the water has nowhere to go and then it starts to back up.
Right.
So
Well, the one real positive about my site is the lowest part is the sandiest. So when it gets down there, it just sinks in.
right. Okay. I hope that helped.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
What I should do, if
I have an unrelated question
Oh.
too.
yeah, go ahead, Amy. Sure.
I have been looking at species that I was really excited about, like the hardy kiwi, that are technically kind of invasive or opportunistic. What are the ethics involved if you don't plan to be in a place forever, ever, of planting something like that, where when you're there, you can manage it, but you know, leave, do you tear it out, or do you just let the net? Yeah, what are the ethics involved in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know people that have had not invasive troubles with that plant, but they are very vigorous, right? They really go. The ethics of it, I would say a lot would depend on the specific type of plant. Like if we were talking about, with kiwi, it's not going to take over the world. It might take over the structure, but it's not going to take over a garden. In my opinion, I haven't seen that happen, at least in my area. It hasn't done that. In fact, we have the opposite challenge with kiwis, is giving them enough moisture, right? Because when we get really intense summers, if they don't have a certain level of moisture, they're unhappy. I don't think this is necessarily the perfect area of the world for them to express their invasiveness, but with other plants, it certainly would be. So I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a blank on a few of these.
Like the Siberian pea shrub is another one I was looking at for a windbreak, but I was going to do it near a beaked hazelnut, and it turns out they compete and can get. Yeah.
That's interesting. Cow, you've heard of cow parsnip? Cow, yeah, I think it's cow. Oh gosh, I'm terrible with common names. I think hogweed might be another. There are some invasives. Yes, you just do not want to plant or plan for a garden, because they're going to become a nightmare for either yourself or somebody else. It'd be almost like planting oh gosh.
Like bamboo is kind of a nightmare if you don't babysit it entirely or contain it.
Yeah. So something, it's that interesting balance between vigor and too much, right? So there's a very interesting climber that we can grow here that's from China, that has very small tubers on the plant, and it's classified as invasive. And once that really gets established, yeah, it could be a scary proposition because the tubers are so small and they're on the, they're not a tuber. They look like a tuber. They're on the plant itself, and as soon as they drop, there's just literally thousands on every plant, that an established plant. So you would, with a kiwi, I don't think I would be worried too much. That would be my opinion. I don't think with the heat that we get in the summer months that it's going to become a problem. They're wonderful plants. And if you are concerned about that particular kiwi, then maybe just look at a different species that's not going to fall into that category. The hardy kiwi, I've heard, can be a bit naughty in the right climate, but there are some other varieties that are just, are beautiful. That Actinidia columicta, that's a really nice plant, has a small fruit, does well in this part of the world. That's a good alternative to the hardy kiwi. So I'm
Colomicta, the Arctic beauty.
yeah, that's lovely. And I believe with that you need a male and a female, and the female, the male has a really interesting foliage, and it has some pink striping in it. It's a great plant. We've had it in our garden for quite a long time, and it produces quite well, and it's certainly never spread.
And you trellis them?
Yeah, you'd want to have a structure for them.
Okay.
Yeah, because they eventually become quite a dominant plant. The kiwi we're all familiar with that much larger fruit, it's extremely vigorous. So it'll put on 6 or 8 feet a year easily. And that one you'd have to put on a structure and prune it. But it's highly unlikely it would be invasive. So if you really want kiwis, just, point yourself in a direction of one that's not, not going to take hold too vigorously. Ben Falk in Vermont, he grows the hardy kiwi successfully without it being a concern for escaping his, but he's a zone, probably zone 4 or 5, a lot cooler. I'm not sure if that helps or not, but
Thank you.
okay. Let me see, maybe what we should do is just take a quick peek at the assignment itself. Where are we? Uh-oh. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, where are we? There we go. So lesson number 8. So we have our local plant survey, and that is pretty straightforward. I don't think there's that's not too mysterious. The plant system design is what people are going to have the most challenge with. And I have a few examples here I can show you. So these are, if you want to take a look at these in more detail, you can take a look once you log into the course under modules, and I believe it's very close to the top of that modules page. You have the student examples. So here's one here, and this person has decided to do a fig guild and has indicated it on their base plan. And then they have filled that in, and you can see here how this, from a 2D overhead, this looks fairly dense. And there's a combination of fig and silverberry and gooseberry, and then some underplantings of a variety of herbs here. So that is this 2D overhead. If you were planting this, if you're on the ground planting this, you could, and you might also, you could probably push these herbaceous plants much closer to the edge of these shrubs and the trees as well. And then this is that cross section that we're looking for. So how is that going to look? So these are existing plants in the background. This is the fig, and looks like that's gooseberry, and then some of these herbaceous plants beneath. And it looks like the gravel driveway here is going to feed some water into that area. So that's one example. This is a good example of that. Here's another that's very different, and I'm not sure why this is an example, because it really doesn't, the student really didn't complete the whole exercise here, because we've got fruit trees, we've got asparagus, ginger, and strawberries, and you can see in this case it's very linear and just one line. So this might represent a pattern that the student's going to repeat. And in this case, they don't have a shrub layer beneath. And I would certainly encourage that, but it does depend on whether this is a, what the rootstock of the apples are. So that's not necessarily the best example. Let's take a look at this one here. And this again, showing I'm not sure if these are yes, these must be existing. And then there's the proposed plan and what's to be added. So instead of showing, so this person has shown tree and shrub symbols, and instead of showing individual symbols in and around it, they've drawn a colored polygon and then stated what they would have within that, and it would be somewhat random. And then we get to that side view. So they have two trees, and then they've got a smaller tree and some mulberries here, and then we're into, don't know if we're into shrub layer. Looks like we're into herbaceous plants. Yeah, so they don't have a shrub layer in this. And given the amount of space, I would really encourage that. And the white mulberry here, I think is going to get a little larger than they think. And that's a silver maple. So that is a very large tree. And then, of course, the mulberry would be an understory to that. And then I could see some shrubs would be a good addition here somewhere, and then the herbaceous. But again, that's my personal opinion, and not right or wrong. Yeah, and I think those are the three examples that I had for you here. We're on base map. That's not quite where we want to be. So that will be the trickiest bit. And most of my feedback for people is going to be ensuring that you're focusing on as many layers as possible. And most of you might feel that you're overplanting. But that may not be the case, right? So try and sort of work through that. Like here, you could think on the side view, you'd think, wow, that's lovely, right? We have the fig, we have a gooseberry, we have some herbaceous plants. The reality is with a fig like this, you probably couldn't get herbaceous plants growing right up to the edge. It, maybe when it's younger, but the fig is going to become a very dominant, have a very dominant root system. So then you'd probably find your herbaceous plants or drip line beyond, but they might start closer in. But I like this idea, and this is a kind of concept that we've run with for years and years, whether it's ornamental or edible, and see really good results in terms of biodiversity, plant health. So in 25 years of designing and installing, never used any synthetic fertilizer, never used any herbicides, and there's just been no pest problems. It's not, these are not monocrop type systems. And because of that, it makes life so much easier. And plus, it looks better because that's what you'd expect to see if you went to the edge of the forest. You'd have a high canopy, a lower canopy, and that edge would be occupied with some plant material. It could be a ground cover. In the Pacific Northwest here, our shrub layer might be salal or mahonia, and then we might have kinnikinnick as a ground cover. We have native strawberries that, may be in there. It's really going to depend on the moisture level of the area, but it's really just mimicking what one would see in a natural setting. Not specifically the plants, but how they are arranged and interact with each other. So that was interesting what you were saying, Amy, about plants that were known to not interact well together. And my experience, that's quite rare when you find that. I find that in most cases, there's a really good relationship going on there. Okay, so we can stop that. So I took a look at I didn't see any questions on the document. So people that are not here today, they didn't have any questions that they wanted answered. So that's great. And does anybody here have anything they'd like to chat about? Happy to, veer off course into any topic that that works for you. Yeah, no problem if there isn't. We're almost at the end of our hour anyhow. But this is I would say in a lot of ways, the planting success with your plantings, you would probably discover if you were to do 2 test beds on your project sites, and one was just more traditional, maybe tree and shrub or just shrubs on their own, and you had a mixed planting of tree and shrub, or if you couldn't occupy a tree, just having that shrub and herbaceous or ground cover layer, you would see a profound difference between the two, not only with insect activity and bird activity, like just birds on their own need that shrub layer, and they need trees as well, but the shrub layer is a vital sort of midpoint between going down onto the ground. right? If they're a ground dweller. So I would really encourage you to keep that in the back of your mind. I'm just trying, I'll find one picture here before we go. For some reason, I can't access my normal photos.
This has
Okay.
definitely been the most exciting so far, but I have a list of probably 45 plants that I'm excited about and trying to figure out where they can all go. And then of course, how to track them down. And
Well, that's
yeah.
great. Well, one thing you will find, and this is where perhaps permaculture in its sort of raw form and traditional, we'll call it landscape architecture, can blend so nicely, is when we look at, say, an urban environment, you can really bring a special quality to it by just considering unity. So we do that all the time. And what we do is we'll say with your plant list, you pick a tree or a shrub that you think is really works for you and resonates. And that we would try and repeat within planting areas and perhaps in other planting areas throughout the property, so that as you're going through it, there's this, it's unified. Even though there can be this tremendous diversity, if you have a lot of diversity, let's say one ofs everywhere, it might aesthetically look really busy, right? You might look at it and go, something's not, right aesthetically. It may be functioning beautifully. So turf grass is a great example, how it unifies. I'm not suggesting anybody should, jump on the turf grass bandwagon, but if you see lawn, it can be quite calming because of that unified look. So it's when you look at the edge of a forest, like if I look out at our forest here, there's Douglas fir, there's arbutus, there's large leaf maple, there's some pines where I live. So 3 or 4 primary plants, and that creates this very easy to look at, gentle backbone to the landscape. So the unity that's just from a purely aesthetic point of view. Just trying to find. I'm sorry, I feel a little bit off kilter today, so I didn't get all my ducks in a row before the class, but let's try and find, here we go. One more picture before we